One of the central claims of the American political tradition, drawn from the moral anthropology of the Enlightenment, is that democratic politics is an art of rationality. That is, the work of politics is argument, debate, compromise, and cooperation. Various parties with distinct interests engage in good faith negotiation in search of a rational form of shared life. As a claim and ideal, political rationality is a necessary feature of democratic life. But it is too easy to lose sight of the role of unreason in democratic politics. This unreason is not the same thing as passion and conviction. Emotion has a crucial role to play in healthy democratic politics, and American history is full of visionaries whom hardcore political rationalists still struggle to understand. The unreason we are interested in here is something different. This unreason is emotive and expressive, and it too draws upon the deep well springs of American collective psychology. But it entirely rejects the Enlightenment vision of the just political community of reasoned compromise. Instead, the politics of unreason imagines a world of us and them, of a noble people beset by hidden enemies, of decent folk at the mercy of unspeakable evil. This tendency, this style of politics, has been present in American life since the invading Puritans stared into the New England forests and imagined the devil looking back at them. The politics of unreason are always paranoid. They depend on the motivating fear that unseen enemies are always on the verge of striking. Just as the natives dispossessed by the settlers were imagined to be supernaturally powerful, even as they were defeated and dispersed, the paranoid style of politics imagines enemies who are simultaneously all powerful and weak. The post war historian of American politics, Richard Hofstadter, coined the phrase the paranoid style of politics to describe this recurrent tendency. He identified it with the broader concept of conspiracy theories, which we'll refer to here as conspiracism. We need to be specific in our language here, because the common idea of conspiracy theories, so often used in the context of our own irrational politics, does not capture what is happening today. For one thing, it is wrong to equate the idea of a conspiracy theory with falsehood. History is full of real conspiracies, many of the details of which might sound fantastic. To take a couple of pertinent examples, the American government really did tell black sharecroppers they'd receive free treatment for syphilis, when in fact they went untreated in order to study the progress of the illness. The CIA really did dose prisoners and other unwitting subjects with LSD to test its potential as a form of mind control. There are bona fide conspiracy theories that, with patient and careful investigation, are found to be absolutely true. We are talking about an altogether different phenomenon, one that tries to buy credibility by pointing out that just because you're paranoid doesn't necessarily mean someone isn't out to get you. This is the kind of conspiracism historians Bernard Bailyn and Gordon Wood had in mind when they described the mindset of American revolutionaries in the 1770s. These Enlightenment rationalists, who believed that all individual actions were the product of moral intention, interpreted every intrusive and overbearing act of the British government as part of a conscious plot to systematically destroy American liberty. Once understood as such, seemingly unconnected developments could be interpreted as further steps in the plot, one so dangerous that only the radical gamble on independence could stop it. This kind of thinking has always played a prominent role in American politics. We are interested in two different varieties of conspiracism: the classical paranoid style that recurs throughout American history, and a contemporary mutation associated most obviously with MAGA and Trumpism. The paranoid style that Hofstadter described can be best understood with reference to some key historical examples, which reflect the common features of the paranoid style. The first feature is persecution. Believers in the paranoid style see themselves as threatened and on the verge of dispossession. They have a keen sense that something they once owned, or were owed, has been unjustly taken away. The more this feeling festers, the more alienated these people feel from society at large, and so the more susceptible they become to fantastic explanations of their situation. Hofstadter notes that people who feel that their social status or class position is threatened are especially prone to the paranoid style. People who feel themselves to be downwardly mobile experience this as persecution, as a dread that they will be treated as social inferiors. This may help explain the popularity of right wing paranoid politics, like those expressed by President Trump, among lower middle class white Americans who interpret mass immigration as a threat to their status. Similar fears drove periods of rabid xenophobia in the past. Mob violence and legal sanctions were used to keep out Chinese and Japanese immigrants to the West Coast on the grounds that these immigrants were dispatched as part of a quiet invasion of America on behalf of the Chinese emperor. Anti Catholic prejudice was rife well into the 20th century, and in the 19th century, Catholic immigrants were also subjected to mob violence on the premise that they were willing agents of the Pope and the Church's plan to exterminate Protestantism in America. The ultimate source of the persecution, however, is a vast and secret conspiracy whose ultimate goal is the destruction of society as we know it. Among 19th century militant Protestants, the Catholic Church was the conspiracy. After all, it had a worldwide organization with agents everywhere. Its Jesuit spies were working to undermine all that was good and decent in society. This may seem very strange now, but in my mother's rural California hometown in 1960, people were hesitant to vote for John F. Kennedy because they'd heard stories that as a Catholic, he would be compelled to take orders from the Pope and not the American people. Whatever the nature of the conspiracy, it is assumed to be run by malevolent actors who are simultaneously strong and weak, ruthless and cowardly. When Hofstadter was writing about this concept in 1964, he had in mind the recent McCarthyist hysteria over communist infiltration of the United States and the emergence of a new paranoid radicalism in the Republican Party, one that would ultimately take control over the party entirely. Republican Senator Joseph McCarthy made his name in the late 1940s by declaring that the American government was infested with Soviet agents who had not only foisted the New Deal on America, but had consciously worked to empower Stalin's Soviet Union and betray the US to a communist takeover. Abetted by allies in Congress, the fierce support of an engaged right wing minority, and a public too unsure and fearful to push back, McCarthyism led to a purge of left wingers from public life. Careers and livelihoods were destroyed in the search for decisive proof of the communist conspiracy. In its most extreme form, like that practiced by the John Birch Society, the real danger, according to them, wasn't from communists in Hollywood or in labor unions. In the Birchers' minds, President Dwight Eisenhower and former Secretary of State George Marshall were conscious agents of the communist conspiracy who used high office to betray their country. The fact that Eisenhower and Marshall had been two of the supreme commanders of American forces during World War II was merely taken as proof of their inconceivable treachery. The same social forces that propelled the McCarthyist outbreak were decisive in shaping the conservative takeover of the Republican Party, which was in part driven by paranoid politics. That is a subject we will cover in more detail in our next lecture. What I want to make clear here is that the paranoid style of politics, with its fantasies of persecution and secret cabals and world shattering hidden truths, is an integral feature of American political life that has, in the last 20 years, been going through a noticeable upsurge in power and reach. The new conspiracism associated with MAGA and Trumpism goes further in crucial respects and in pursuit of slightly different goals. The most important feature of the new conspiracism is that it is entirely baseless and abandons even the pretense of evidence. One notable feature of classical paranoid politics is that it makes a great fetish of evidence, understood as a random pool of data whose disconnected context allows for all sorts of wild interpretations. Conspiracists have traditionally gone to great lengths to document their views and present tortured interpretations of masses of information. Think of how many millions of pages have been written about the assassination of President Kennedy and the possible conspiracy underlying it. The new conspiracism abandons this in favor of nothing at all. Bold-faced lies are repeated again and again with no evidence at all, except the vague suggestion that if a lot of people are talking about a lie, there must be something to it. This is conspiracy without the theory, relying instead on free floating claims that are taken as true simply because they exist. This kind of conspiracism is especially sinister because it doesn't just claim that true knowledge of the world is hidden and must be sought out. Instead, it denies the reality of knowledge altogether. This is one reason why this style of conspiracism attacks society's producers of knowledge, from universities to the Census Bureau. The general effect of this attack is to delegitimize these institutions. Conspiracism rejects the meaning, value, and authority of these institutions, and by extension does the same thing to democracy itself. Democracy as a system requires certain underlying habits and assumptions in order to function. Chief among these is a basic sense of trust. For instance, in the good faith and honesty of election workers to record votes faithfully. We have seen this new conspiracism invade and corrode political life in the past decade, a trend that dramatically accelerated during the Trump administration and is now yielding poisonous consequences in the president's refusal to concede the election, along with efforts by his allies to validate the president's lies by trying to overturn that election. The new conspiracism has conclusively shown itself to be a threat to democracy, and we cannot defeat it if we do not understand it.